The rain hadn't touched the glass for hours, yet the windows of Nathaniel Brooks's penthouse were still streaked with the memory of it. Seattle's skyline blinked through the dusk, like a distant constellation, cold, unreachable, beautiful only in its indifference. From where he sat, high above the humming streets, Nathaniel could see everything except the parts of life that mattered. He used to live for this view. The city, alive with movement, once mirrored his mind, ambitious, relentless, ever building. He'd built his company, Orion Lab, from a single idea scrawled on a napkin in a noisy college bar into one of the most respected software firms on the West Coast. At 37, he had rooms full of awards, shelves heavy with patents, and a net worth that could silence boardrooms. But the room he sat in now was heavy with something else entirely. Silence pressed against his ribs like cold marble. The accident had changed everything. A ski trip, a misjudged jump, a silence in the snow that followed before anyone could scream. The spinal injury had taken away movement below his waist, but it was the doctor's quiet sentence that had undone him entirely. "You'll likely never father a child." He remembered those words, not as a statement, but as a theft. It was not a clean cut, but it was a slow unraveling. The woman he'd been dating at the time, someone the tabloids had once dubbed Tech's golden couple, left within 3 weeks. No goodbye, no apology. Just one morning, her side of the bed was cold, and the closet hung empty. A month later, she appeared on a magazine cover with an exclusive interview titled, "Loving a Man Who Can't Love You Back." The headlines had changed overnight. Brilliance broken, the rise and fall of Nathaniel Brooks, and his least favorite, the infertile king of Silicon Sound. He didn't scream, didn't deny. He went back to work, smiled through quarterly reviews, donated to research foundations, attended board meetings in tailored suits, sitting tall in the wheelchair no one dared mention aloud. But inside, he was folding in on himself slowly, invisibly, endlessly. That night, the penthouse was dim. He didn't bother with overhead lights anymore. Only a single lamp lit the room, its glow flickering over the surface of his whiskey glass. He hadn't touched it. He rarely drank. He didn't need alcohol to feel dizzy. Outside, car headlights wove through the streets like fireflies. Somewhere below, someone was laughing loud, free, alive. Nathaniel exhaled through his nose, steady and soft. He knew better than to envy strangers, but that didn't stop the ache from settling deep in his chest. Baby photos were hidden in the bottom drawer of his study, not of any child he'd had, but from a photo bank he once downloaded in a late night of hope, imagining what his future might look like. Chubby hands, sleepy smiles, names he'd thought of in silence. Jude, Miles, Eden. Now, they were just empty syllables echoing in a space too ample for one man. The elevator chimed behind him. He didn't turn. It would be Serena. It was always Serena around this hour. He closed his eyes for a moment longer, letting the warmth of her expected presence settle like a quilt on his spine. She was never loud when she entered, never filled the room with noise. A stillness that didn't press down, only made the air feel less sharp. Tonight, he didn't want to talk. He didn't want to stretch. He didn't want to be Nathaniel Brooks, the symbol of resilience. He just wanted to sit there, motionless, and pretend the view outside was a painting, not a world moving on without him. But even as he wished that, even as he tightened his hands on the armrests of his wheelchair, he knew something had begun to shift. He didn't know whether it would save or undo him completely. If you've ever looked at someone from the outside and thought you knew their whole story, think again. Nathaniel's story is only beginning. And sometimes, Beginnings are disguised as endings. If this first chapter touched you, comment and tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you believe in stories that start in broken places but grow into something extraordinary, follow our channel, like this video, and stay close. The next part might take your breath away. The elevator door opened with its usual soft chime, like a sigh slipping into the quiet. Nathaniel didn't lift his gaze. He didn't need to. He could already sense her presence before she stepped into the room, like warm air arriving before dawn, subtle but certain. Serena Walker moved the way music moves when played just below a whisper, calm, rhythmic, never demanding attention yet impossible to ignore. She entered the penthouse, carrying a small folded blanket in her arms. Her black braid was tucked over one shoulder, and her clothes were simple leggings, a soft green sweatshirt, comfortable sneakers. But on her, it looked like Grace itself had dressed her. "I saw your light," she said, her voice low, as if raising it might disrupt something delicate. "Thought you might need this." Nathaniel finally turned toward her, his expression unreadable. She walked across the room without waiting for permission. She never asked permission to be kind. With gentle hands, she laid the blanket across his lap, smoothing it without comment. He didn't speak for a moment, but when he did, it was soft. "Thank you. You're welcome." She crouched beside his chair, her eyes lifting to meet his. They were deep, dark, and unwavering, eyes that didn't flinch from another's pain. "Can't sleep again?" He shrugged, the corner of his mouth twitching upward without humor. "Work on my mind." It was a half-truth, and they both knew it. Her hand hovered for a beat, caught between professionalism and something more instinctive, then gently touched his forearm. The contact was brief, light, but for Nathaniel, it might as well have been thunder. His entire body seemed to register it, even the parts he hadn't felt in years. "You don't have to do this alone, you know." He turned away, eyes returning to the glass. "I've been doing it alone for a long time. That doesn't mean you have to keep doing it." Her words weren't pushy. They carried no expectation, just an offer, like a door left ajar, not wide open. She rose, ready to give him back his silence, but paused at the edge of the room. "If you ever need anything, I'm here." Then she disappeared the same way she came, leaving only the faintest scent of vanilla and linen behind her. Nathaniel didn't move. He stared at the city and felt that scent wrap around him like memory. He hadn't meant to notice her, not at first. Serena had come recommended by his lawyer, of all people, and had shown up on the first day with a file full of credentials and a quiet smile that didn't try too hard. She didn't ask for a tour of the place. She didn't make small talk about the view. She had only asked, "Where would you like to start?" He remembered being annoyed by her restraint, and then, slowly, he remembered respecting it. Serena never treated him like he was broken. She corrected his posture with a firm hand, guided his breath through stretches, and tracked his sleep cycles and water intake meticulously. But she never pitied him, never tiptoed, never spoke to him like he was a wound that might reopen. Some days, she brought jazz records and let the saxophone fill the space. Other days, she said almost nothing at all. Nathaniel couldn't tell when it changed, when she went from being the woman who worked in his home to the only person who didn't feel like noise. He hated that he noticed things, that he knew she sometimes hummed under her breath while folding towels, that she used almond-scented lotion. She wore a ring on her right pinky too small for style, maybe sentimental. He hated that he thought of her late at night, wondered what she dreamt about, whether anyone held her when the city slept, But more than anything, he hated how she made the quiet bearable. That night, he sat in the stillness long after she left. Then he rolled his chair into the den, one of the rooms she'd never stepped into, and turned on the lamp. It flickered for a second, before settling into a soft, golden hum. On the far wall stood the old upright piano he hadn't touched since the accident. Dust clung to the keys. Sheet music lay curled on the stand. The room smelled faintly of cedar and long-forgotten dreams. He rolled closer, his hand hovering over the keys, but not quite landing. Instead, his fingers rested on his lap, unmoving. A thought crept into the corners of his mind, dangerous and delicate. What if it wasn't too late? Not just for music, not just for movement, but for something else. Something he hadn't allowed himself to name in years. He closed his eyes and let the thought breathe. And somewhere in another part of the apartment, Serena stood in her room, staring at the small scar that traced the inside of her wrist, faint now, almost forgotten. A reminder of what she once lost, a life that had ended before it began. She didn't speak of it, not to anyone. But when she saw Nathaniel's pain, she recognized it not because she'd read it in his file, but because she'd lived it too. And that night, they each fell asleep separately, silently carrying the same unspoken question. If healing was still possible, what would it take to begin? Morning in Seattle didn't always arrive with sunshine. Often, it came wrapped in a low mist, the kind that blurred edges and made everything look a little softer, a little quieter. On that particular Wednesday, the sky was the color of worn linen, and the air carried the gentle chill of a season still deciding who it wanted to be. Nathaniel Brooks sat by the window, already dressed in charcoal sweats and a fitted long sleeve that clung to his frame more out of routine than vanity. His hair was still damp from a reluctant shower, and a faint shadow traced his jaw. He'd skipped shaving again. Outside, the rain tapped the glass in a patient rhythm. Inside, the silence waited, poised. He hadn't slept. Again. The city pulsed below him, oblivious. Somewhere between the sleepless hours and the weight of his stillness, Nathaniel had decided to cancel the session. Say he wasn't feeling well. Blame a tight shoulder or a project deadline, anything to delay seeing her. But the thought of Serena walking into the room and finding it empty unsettled him more than it should have. The elevator chimed, and it was too late. She entered with the usual grace. A duffel bag slung over one shoulder, curls pulled into a low bun. A few tendrils had escaped, framing her face in a way she never seemed to notice. She didn't say much as she stepped inside, but didn't need to. Her presence was always enough to shift the air. "Good morning," she offered, her voice still thick with the softness of dawn. He nodded in return, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're early." "You're not usually by the window at this hour," she said, setting her bag down and retrieving a mat from the corner. "Something different today?" Nathaniel hesitated. "Didn't sleep." She unrolled the mat, smoothing the edges with a practiced hand. "Then maybe we focus less on movement today, more on breath, on presence." He gave a low laugh, bitter at the edges. "Presence isn't my strength." Serena didn't flinch. Instead, she walked over to the nearby record player, a vintage piece she had eyed curiously the week she started, though never once touched until now. Without asking, she lifted the lid and sifted through the stack of records beneath. Her fingers paused over a sleeve with a worn blue spine and pulled it out. Coltrane. She placed it carefully, let the needle drop, and soon the room was filled with the aching warmth of a tenor saxophone. The sound curled around them like steam from a forgotten mug, weaving through the corners of the penthouse and brushing past the silence like an old friend. Nathaniel blinked, caught off guard. You knew I had that? I saw it once. On your shelf. She turned toward him, one brow lifting. I figured anyone who owns this knows what it's for. He studied her, uncertain. And what's it for? To remind you that broken things still make music. The words struck something soft, deep, and unguarded. Serena knelt on the mat and looked up at him, palm outstretched. Join me? His instinct was to say no, to stay in his chair, protected by distance and the illusion of control. But something about her tone, gentle, never coaxing, made refusal feel hollow. So he nodded, let her wheel the chair close, then brace his shoulders as he slid, slowly and carefully, onto the floor. It wasn't graceful. His right leg dragged slightly, and his balance faltered. But she didn't correct him, didn't fuss. She just sat across from him, cross-legged, hands resting on her knees, eyes steady. The music filled the space between them. She guided him through breath first, long inhales through the nose, slow exhales through the mouth. Each breath peeled away a layer of resistance. Then she asked him to close his eyes, to listen, not to her voice, not to his thoughts, but to the space between the notes. It was maddening at first. His mind, trained to solve, compute, and chase patterns, rebelled against the stillness. But her voice, soft and rhythmic, kept bringing him back. Breathe in, pause, breathe out. And gradually, the silence stopped feeling like absence. It began to feel like a place. After several minutes, Serena shifted forward and gently lifted his arm, rotating his shoulder in slow circles. Her fingers were firm and confident. The contact was professional, but Nathaniel felt his pulse quicken. She must have felt it too. Her gaze flicked upward for a moment, meeting his. But neither of them spoke. The silence between them was no longer awkward. It was charged. As they moved into the next stretch, Serena placed one hand at the base of his spine and one on his knee, anchoring his posture. He winced slightly. Too much? No, he said, his voice raspier than usual. Just not used to being this still. You don't have to be still to be present, she murmured. Stillness is how the body listens when the mind finally gets quiet. He wasn't sure if she was talking about the stretch anymore. When the session ended, she helped him back into the chair, her movements smooth and unfaltering. The record had stopped playing. The room was quiet again. But it wasn't the same quiet. Nathaniel looked at her then, really looked. Her skin was radiant with effort, a fine sheen on her brow. Her chest rose and fell in a calm rhythm. She didn't look at everything out of place here. In this space. In his life. He opened his mouth, ready to say something he didn't know what. But Serena beat him to it. I brought soup, she said, gesturing toward her bag. Lentil and rosemary. Nothing fancy. His lips lifted before he could stop them. You always feed your clients? Only the ones who forget to eat when they forget how to sleep. He shook his head, the smile still lingering. You know, you talk like a therapist sometimes. She tilted her head. Only because I've needed one. Their eyes held again. This time, longer. Nathaniel didn't ask. He didn't press. But something in him shifted just slightly, like a door inside him, once rusted shut, giving a little beneath the weight of her presence. As she unpacked the thermos in the kitchen, humming quietly to herself, Nathaniel remained by the window, and the silence didn't ask anything of him for the first time in weeks. It simply sat with him, and stayed. The rain had faded by evening, leaving behind a quiet hush that wrapped around the city like a well-worn coat. Everything outside Nathaniel's windows gleamed with that post-storm stillness, slick sidewalks, treetops heavy with water, reflections dancing in shallow puddles. Yet the atmosphere remained taut within the penthouse, like a cord pulled too tight. Nathaniel sat at his desk in the study, the soft click of keyboard keys a steady rhythm against the muted hush of the night. Serena had left hours ago after a session that ended not with words, but a silence thick with something unspoken. He hadn't touched the soup she brought. It still sat in the kitchen, unopened. He wasn't hungry, not for food anyway. His eyes flicked across the lines of code on his screen, but they registered as meaningless patterns. Logic escaped him tonight, and that fact alone annoyed him. Work had always been where he hid when everything else felt too loud and fragile. But now, not even that refuge could hold him. A sound echoed softly in his mind, her voice. Stillness is how the body listens when the mind finally gets quiet. And maybe his mind wasn't loud for the first time in years. Just quiet. Unsettlingly so. He closed his laptop with a gentle thud and wheeled away from the desk, gliding slowly down the hallway, past the living room with its amber lights, past the kitchen with its untouched soup. His hand hesitated when it reached the final door, the one room no one entered. Even Serena had never asked. It wasn't locked literally, but in the way sure doors remain shut, simply because no one dares to open them. He pushed it open. The room smelled faintly of cedarwood and forgotten time. It was smaller than the others, windowless, tucked into the back corner of the apartment. On one side stood a low bookshelf stacked with journals, dusty photo albums, and a few hand-carved figurines from a trip he once took to Kyoto. A cello leaned in the far corner, its strings long since loosened, bow resting silently beside it. But the heart of the room was the crib, unassembled, untouched, white, sleek, Scandinavian, in design the kind you saw in design magazines. He remembered ordering it during a sleepless night, when hope was still something he carried efficiently. Before the accident, before the news, before everything had become a story people whispered about in elevators. He hadn't been expecting a baby. Not yet. But he and Marissa, his ex, had talked about it, had planned for it, in that way people do when they still believe time is on their side. He remembered holding the instruction manual in his hands, feeling both terrified and oddly ready. But when the diagnosis came first, the paralysis, then the infertility, he never even opened the box. The box now sat in the corner, covered in a thin plastic sheet, like a shrine to a life that had dissolved before it ever arrived. Nathaniel let out a slow breath and rolled further in. His hand brushed the edge of the sheet, and for a moment, he almost pulled it back. Almost. But he didn't. Instead, he wheeled to the bookshelf and took down one of the photo albums. It was dark brown, and the leather cracked slightly at the edges. He opened it on his lap, fingers hovering over the pages. The first photo was of him as a boy, 8 years old, sitting beside a much younger woman with long auburn hair and a weary smile. His mother, she died when he was 11. He didn't talk about her, not even to himself. She'd been a music teacher, known for humming Bach while folding laundry and making dinner with a glass of red wine always within reach. It was her cello that rested in the corner now. She had taught him how to read music before he ever touched a keyboard. After she passed, he put both piano and cello away, choosing to build silence instead. Another photo, him at 18, grinning beside his father, who looked tired even in joy. Then, a blank stretch, a whole decade without photos. Work had consumed him. Progress became the only story he knew how to write. Until Serena. She didn't know any of this. He had never let her see past the surface. Not really. But her presence. It didn't knock on the door to his past, it simply waited nearby, like a light outside a closed room. Patient. Constant. And that patience was more terrifying than pity. He didn't know how long he sat there, fingers tracing photographs, memories settling like dust. But eventually, he heard the elevator chime again. A moment later, there was a soft knock on the study door. Not the hallway door, the one behind him. He turned. She stood there, hesitating. "I know you didn't answer," Serena said gently. "But the soup, I didn't want it to go to waste." Nathaniel blinked, momentarily disoriented. "You came back?" She nodded. "Something told me you hadn't eaten. Something else told me you were in here." He didn't respond right away. Then he nodded toward the photo album. "I haven't opened this in years." She stepped in slowly, her gaze brushing over the room without judgment, without surprise. Her eyes lingered on the cello, the unassembled crib, and finally, back to him. "This room holds a lot," she said, not as a question, but as a recognition. "It does." His voice was low. "Some days, it feels heavier than the chair." Serena crossed the room without a word and sat on the floor beside him, legs tucked beneath her. She didn't ask about the photos, didn't press about the crib. She looked at him with the kind of softness that made it difficult to breathe. "I think," she said finally, "we all have a room like this. Some of us don't have to keep walking past it daily." He swallowed hard. For a moment, the weight of everything pressed so close he thought it might crush him. But then he felt her hand, resting gently atop his. Not pulling, just present. And maybe that was all he'd needed. Not someone to fix what had been broken, but someone who knew how to sit in the room with him, without turning away. The next morning unfolded not with noise but stillness, as if the world held its breath. Outside, the air hung heavy, cloaked in the softness of early light. A quiet blue bled through the clouds, neither cold nor warm, just waiting. The windows of Nathaniel's penthouse glistened faintly from the night's lingering mist, and inside, the rhythm of the day had not yet begun. Nathaniel woke with a start, not from a dream, but from the absence of one. He blinked up at the ceiling, disoriented momentarily, his breath caught between sleep and memory. He didn't usually dream anymore, didn't let his mind wander that far. But after Serena left the study last night, something in him had shifted so quietly that he only now noticed the weight was different. Not lighter, just rearranged. He sat up slowly, the stiffness in his shoulders a familiar ache. As he maneuvered into the chair, his eyes fell on the photo album he'd left open. It was still resting on the edge of the bookshelf, as if it had also spent the night keeping watch. He wheeled toward the kitchen. To his surprise, the thermos Serena had brought was gone. Instead, on the counter sat a small container, covered with foil, and a yellow sticky note pressed against it. The handwriting was her own, neat and slightly slanted. "I figured you might be more of a next day person. Warm it slowly. Stir halfway." He didn't smile, not outwardly, but something about the note caught in his chest. It was her way of speaking without stepping too close, of staying near without crossing into territory he hadn't yet opened. Later that afternoon, they met in the sunroom, where the floor-to-ceiling windows spilled golden light across the hardwood floor. The session began like any other with breath, alignment, and a short series of assisted movements. But something between them had softened, even if neither addressed it directly. Nathaniel noticed it first in how Serena adjusted his position, not with instruction this time, but with quiet understanding, as if her hands remembered his body better than his own. At one point, she guided him into a twist, her palms steady at the base of his back. The movement was subtle, controlled, but his balance faltered. One wheel nudged the edge of the mat, and before he could stop it, the chair tilted with a sickening lurch. It happened fast. His arm shot out instinctively, but it wasn't enough. He hit the floor hard, shoulder first, the breath knocked out of him. Pain sparked down his side like lit wires. Serena gasped, her expression breaking open with concern. "Nathaniel, I'm fine." The words came sharply, automatically. He pushed at the floor with trembling hands, trying to sit upright, but his legs sprawled uselessly beneath him. He bit down against the frustration, jaw tight. "Let me," she began. "I said I'm fine." But his voice cracked on the last syllable. There was no hiding it. Not the tremor in his fingers. Not the sting behind his eyes. Not the helplessness that came roaring back, fierce and unforgiving. He slammed a fist into the floor, the sound echoing in the room like a gunshot. Serena flinched, but only for a second. Then she moved toward him, slowly, with the kind of care you give a frightened animal. She knelt beside him, and wordlessly placed one hand on his back. Not to fix, not to rescue, to stay. "Nathaniel," she said quietly, "please, let me help." For a moment, he couldn't look at her, couldn't breathe around the pride coiled in his throat like a fist. But then something in him loosened, not all at once, but enough. He gave the slightest nod. She braced his back, shifted her knees beneath him, and with surprising strength helped him sit upright, leaning gently against the nearby couch. Her breath mingled with his steady, quiet, unwavering. "I'm sorry," he murmured at last, eyes trained on the floor. "I shouldn't have yelled. There's nothing to apologize for." Her voice was warm but firm. "You fell. That's not weakness. That's gravity." A sound escaped him then, half laugh, half sob. One tear slipped down his cheek, catching him off guard. Serena caught it with her thumb, her soft touch unraveling something buried deep. He didn't stop the others when they came. For years, he'd taught himself to hold everything in, to stay composed, clean-edged, untouchable. But there, in that room, pressed against the couch, and a woman who refused to let him turn away from himself, he broke open. The sobs came quietly at first, then full and deep, his shoulders shaking against her hand. He pressed his face into her shoulder, not in search of comfort, but because there was nowhere else safe enough to fall apart. Serena held him, not tightly, not with desperation, just firmly enough to remind him that he wasn't alone. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered. And somehow, he believed her. When his breathing finally steadied, he pulled back slowly, his eyes red, cheeks damp. Embarrassment hovered close, but she didn't give it space. She met his gaze with something fiercer than pity-compassion, that saw everything and flinched at nothing. "Elena," he said. She looked at him, surprised. "It's Serena." He blinked. "What? You just called me Elena." Nathaniel closed his eyes. "Sorry," he whispered. Serena didn't ask who Elena was. She didn't correct him again. Instead, she brushed his hair away from his forehead, fingers lingering for a moment longer than they had to. "You don't have to be okay right away," she said softly. "But you don't have to stay in pieces either." He nodded, slow and unsure. They stayed there, seated on the floor in a halo of late afternoon light. For once, no one filled the silence. No one tried to fix it. It held them both. And that, somehow, was enough. That evening, the sun dipped below the line of rooftops, casting long amber shadows through the penthouse's windows. A hush settled across the rooms, not the sterile quiet of absence, but a kind of afterglow, like breath held just after a confession. Nathaniel hadn't spoken much since the fall, since the unraveling. He'd retreated to the study, though not with the usual need to hide. He hadn't locked the door. He hadn't drawn the blinds. He sat there, staring at the cello in the corner, its strings slack, its shape familiar and foreign all at once. The weight in his chest had changed. No lighter, but shifted and redistributed into corners he could manage. Maybe it was because someone had finally seen him at his most brittle and hadn't looked away. Maybe because she didn't ask for explanations, just stayed. Serena hadn't left immediately after the fall. She had stayed long enough to make tea mint with a sliver of honey and set it gently on the end table beside him. Then she'd written something on a slip of paper and quietly slipped it under the edge of the mug before letting herself out. Now, hours later, the tea had gone cold, but the note remained. He picked it up with careful fingers, her handwriting again, elegant, deliberate. What breaks us isn't always what ends us. Sometimes, it's what lets the light in. He read it twice, folded it, and tucked it into his sweater pocket. He didn't need more than that. The note wasn't trying to be profound, but honest, like hers. The elevator chimed sometime near 9. He turned, expecting the quiet shuffle of Serena's shoes, her familiar silhouette. But the door remained closed. It was a memory, a phantom echo. He wasn't used to wanting her there when she wasn't scheduled to be. He wasn't used to wanting anything at all, beyond functionality. But tonight, the apartment felt oddly incomplete in her absence. The edges of things are too sharp, and the air is still too sharp. He wheeled into the living room and paused at the piano bench. The keys waited, yellowed slightly with time, quiet as a held breath. He hadn't touched this instrument in years and hadn't dared, but his fingers hovered now, just above middle C before pressing gently down. One note, then another. The sound rang out low and soft, slightly uneven, like a voice not yet sure of itself. He played 2 bars of an old melody, something his mother used to hum while stirring soup, unfinished and unremarkable, but tender in the way forgotten songs always are. And then he stopped, because the elevator did chime. This time, when the doors opened, Serena stood there. Her jacket was damp, curls scattered by the wind, cheeks flushed from the evening chill. She held no bag, no clipboard, no notes. Just a paper-wrapped bundle cradled in her arms and eyes that searched for something unsaid. He blinked. "You're not on the schedule." "I know," she replied, stepping in slowly. "I didn't come for therapy." He watched her closely. "Then why did you come?" She hesitated, then lifted the bundle slightly. "You forgot this." It was the hoodie he had left in the sunroom earlier that day, forgotten after the fall. But there was something else in the way she held it. A subtle tension. A question folded into the gesture. He reached for it, and their hands brushed. The contact was brief. Too brief. "You okay?" she asked finally, voice quieter now. "I don't know." He looked down at the hoodie in his lap. "I've never been good at answering that." Serena moved toward the couch and sat, curling one leg beneath her. She didn't speak for a while, and neither did he. The silence between them was no longer fragile. It had its shape now, tentative, yes, but honest. Comfortable in the way unspoken things sometimes are. Finally, she broke it. "Do you want to know why I became a therapist?" Nathaniel turned toward her, surprised. "I assumed it was the degrees on your wall." She smiled faintly. "No, that came later." He waited. She folded her hands in her lap, fingers interlaced tightly. "My younger sister was born with a rare muscle disorder. Nothing dramatic at first, just slower than most kids. But by 12, she needed full-time assistance." Serena's voice was steady, but her eyes didn't lift from her hands. "I helped with everything. Meals, dressing, nights when she couldn't breathe without the machine." Nathaniel's throat tightened. "She never complained," Serena continued. She'd say the hardest part wasn't the pain. It was the way people looked at her, like her body made her invisible. He exhaled, barely a sound. What happened to her? She died 3 weeks before I turned 20. The room stilled. I'd already applied to architecture school, she said softly. But after the funeral, I couldn't draw buildings. All I could think about was what it meant to help someone live better, live fully, even when they couldn't walk, speak, or feed themselves. I wanted to be someone who stayed. The way most people don't. She looked up then, and her eyes, dark, open, impossibly steady, met his. That's why I came back tonight, she said. Because I didn't want to leave you in that room, after what happened. Nathaniel swallowed hard. He didn't know what to say. There was no appropriate response to a gift like that, so he didn't say anything. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out her note, unfolding it slowly. He placed it gently on the table between them. She saw it and understood. Then, with a wordless grace, Serena stood and walked toward him. She didn't touch him, didn't kneel or lean down. She stood in front of him, close enough that he could feel the warmth rising from her skin, smell the faint trace of lavender in her coat. You don't have to say anything, she whispered. And he didn't. But as his hand rose and lightly brushed her fingers, tentative, unsure, he felt it. Something inside him, long frozen, had begun to thaw. Not all at once, but enough, and that was how it began. Not with declarations or grand gestures, but with silence that finally felt safe enough to be shared. By morning's arrival, the city had washed itself in rain again. Fine mist clung to the windows, making everything beyond them look like watercolor, blurred outlines of rooftops, faint silhouettes of moving cars, puddles blooming like secrets on the streets below. Nathaniel sat near the window, not working, not thinking, just watching. One hand rested on the wheel of his chair, the other holding a mug that had long gone cold. Across the room, the faint scent of Serena still lingered in the air. Lavender, mint, a trace of something warm and quiet he couldn't quite name. He hadn't expected her to stay the night, and technically, she hadn't. After that strange, delicate moment between them, she left when words weren't enough, and silence said too much. But it had changed something. Not between them, necessarily, but inside him. The piano keys echoed faintly in his memory, as did the image of her eyes, soft but steady, as she told him about her sister. He hadn't known what it meant to carry someone else's grief without letting it eclipse your own. Not until now. When the doorbell rang just after 10, he thought it might be her again. But it wasn't. It was Jordan Marks, his business partner and closest, if not only, friend. Jordan stepped inside without waiting to be invited. He never did. Tall, broad-shouldered, always in dark layers and weathered boots, he brought the scent of coffee and rain. You've been dodging meetings, he said without preamble. Nathaniel gave a tired smile. Good morning to you too. Jordan dropped into the armchair across from him, setting a to-go cup on the table between them. Look, I get it. The board's a mess. The investors are restless, and half of Orion's staff thinks you're either dying or reinventing yourself as a monk. I'm not dying, Nathaniel said calmly. Good, because they're betting on Monk. Nathaniel laughed, despite himself. Jordan leaned forward, elbows on knees. You okay? The question was casual, almost disguised, but his eyes were sharp. Nathaniel hesitated. He could have answered with deflection, with sarcasm, but something in him was too tired for that now. No, he said. Not really. But I think I'm trying. Jordan studied him for a long moment, then nodded. She's helping? It wasn't a question. Nathaniel didn't answer. Jordan reached for the coffee and took a slow sip. I saw her once, in the lobby. She looked like someone who doesn't flinch easily. No, Nathaniel said, almost to himself. She doesn't. There was a pause. Jordan didn't press. That was what made him bearable. He knew when to ask and when to leave space. Look, he said finally. Whatever this is, I hope you let it happen for once. You're allowed, you know, to need someone, to want something more than control. Nathaniel didn't reply, but something in his posture eased. After Jordan left, the quiet settled back in, but it no longer felt like exile, more like pause. Just after lunch, Serena returned for the session. She wore her usual quiet uniform, dark leggings, soft cotton top, no makeup except for a faint gloss on her lips that caught the light in unexpected moments. Her hair was pulled back, but a single curl had slipped free at her temple. It danced as she walked. He didn't greet her with his usual reserve. Instead, he gestured toward the music room. "Can we start in there today?" he asked. Her expression didn't change much, but her eyes shimmered with something unspoken. She nodded once and followed. Inside, the piano waited. He wheeled to it slowly, his hand brushing the wood as if reacquainting himself with an old friend. She sat nearby on the floor, legs folded, notebook open, but untouched. Nathaniel pressed a key, middle C, then another, then a chord. The sound filled the room like breath, like permission. "I used to play for hours," he murmured, eyes on the keys. "Before the accident, before the noise. My mom taught me." "She must have been patient," Serena said gently. "She was, but not quite. She used to sing while chopping vegetables. Opera, off-key." He smiled, and Serena did too. He began to play a halting melody, rough at the edges. But something true lived inside it. Serena listened, hands folded in her lap, as if afraid to move and break the spell. When he finished, the final note hanging in the air like a held breath, she said softly, "That wasn't just music." "I know." He looked at her. "It's the only way I know how to tell the truth." She stood then and walked toward him. Not too close, not quite. "You don't have to explain it," she said, "but I'm here if you ever do." He wanted to reach for her, to touch the hem of the certainty she carried, to anchor himself there. But instead he asked, "Do you believe people can begin again, even when they've stopped trying?" She looked at him for a long time. "I don't think we ever really stop trying," she said. "We just stop believing it will mean something." "And do you think it can?" She stepped forward now, close enough for her hand to rest gently on his shoulder. "I think you're already beginning," she whispered. The silence between them pulsed, and for the first time in so long, Nathaniel didn't feel like a ruin. He felt like a room with a light just turned on. Dusty, unfinished, yes, but warm, waiting. He looked at her hand, the way her fingers curved, not demanding, just steady. He nodded. Just once, because he wasn't ready to say it yet. But the music had already spoken for him. The evening followed was the quiet only Seattle could create, gray-blue skies that hung low enough to touch, air thick with a mist that blurred everything into softness. It wasn't raining, not exactly. It was something gentler, more patient. The sort of drizzle that soaked through your coat before you even noticed, but never felt cruel. Serena didn't drive home after their session. She could have. She had her keys. Her jacket was dry. There was nothing on paper that demanded she stay. And yet, her feet didn't move toward the elevator. Instead, she stood just outside the music room, her back resting lightly against the wall, arms folded. From where she stood, she could still hear the faint echo of the piano what he'd played, or maybe just the memory of it. The notes hadn't been flawless, but the emotion beneath them had been so honest and startling that it had made her chest ache. She didn't know what exactly she was waiting for, only that leaving now felt wrong, rushed, incomplete. Inside, Nathaniel remained seated at the piano, his hands resting on the keys. He hadn't moved since she stepped out. Something had settled over him after that final chord, something fragile and trembling. Not regret, not pain, release. It was strange, he thought. Letting someone witness your softness could make you feel steadier, not weaker. After a while, he rolled back from the piano and turned toward the hallway, surprised to find her still there. "You didn't go," he said quietly. Serena looked over, eyes calm. "No." He didn't ask why. She didn't offer. They looked at each other momentarily, an invisible, unspoken but understood dialogue between them. Then she stepped forward. "You're warm. You should get some air." He blinked. "Air?" She tilted her head toward the rooftop garden. "I saw it the other day. Thought you'd never take anyone up there." "I don't." She raised a brow. He hesitated, then nodded once. The rooftop was empty when they arrived, save for a few pots of rosemary and rain-drenched planters that had once held tomatoes. Nathaniel hadn't touched them in nearly a year, but the space was still beautiful, bordered by low lights, the city spread out like a scattered constellation beneath them. She walked beside him in silence, letting the mist settle in her hair, her breath visible in the chill. "You planted these?" she asked, kneeling to touch a sprig of basil that had somehow survived. "A long time ago," he murmured, "when I thought I'd still be building something." She didn't correct him, didn't say you still are. She knew some truths had to be walked through, not argued with. They stopped near the railing. He looked out over the city, jaw set, eyes distant. "I used to come up here when I couldn't sleep," he said, "just to feel something. Wind, cold, anything that wasn't silence." Serena wrapped her arms around herself. Nathaniel glanced sideways at her. "Are you cold?" She shook her head. "No." But he unzipped his hoodie anyway, shrugged it off, and handed it to her. It was absurd, him, offering warmth he didn't fully feel in his legs, but she didn't argue. She slipped it on. It smelled like cedar, soap, and something quieter like shelter. They stood like that for a while, shoulder to shoulder, watching the city blink and breathe. Then, softly, he said, "I used to be afraid of the night." She looked at him. "Not because of the dark," he added, "but because of what it brought with it. The stillness. The way everything I tried not to feel came flooding back. You know what I mean?" Serena nodded, gaze steady. "I do." He turned fully now, his eyes meeting hers. They were so close, closer than they'd ever been. And still, neither stepped back. "I think I kept letting people leave," he whispered, "so I wouldn't have to be the one to need." Serena's throat tightened. "And now?" she asked. "I don't know," he admitted. "But tonight, I didn't want you to go." The rain thickened around them, still soft, but undeniable. Her curls were dampened, his sleeves darkened, and in that slowness, that beautiful uncertain quiet, she stepped toward him. Just one step. Enough. Her hand found his. She didn't squeeze. She didn't cling. She just held. And Nathaniel let himself be held for the first time in years. The moment passed without thunder. No grand kiss. No cinematic promise. Just skin against skin. breath shared in the hush of a rooftop garden. He didn't know how long they stood like that, but when they turned to go inside, something invisible had changed between them. Later that night, Serena sat on the guest bed she rarely used, wrapped in one of his old flannel blankets, her eyes drawn to the storm outside. Her fingers traced the edge of her teacup, but her thoughts drifted elsewhere. To the way he had looked at her, not with longing or desperation, but with something quieter, recognition. And Nathaniel, in his room just down the hall, lay awake, listening to the sound of rain tapping against the glass. Not dreading it, just listening, and knowing she was there, somewhere in the same silence. Morning unfolded in silence, the kind that wasn't heavy, but full of breath, like a held pause before music resumed. The clouds had thinned sometime at night, leaving the sky streaked with soft, pale blue. It was the kind of morning that didn't announce itself. It simply waited to be noticed. Serena stirred before the alarm. She hadn't meant to fall asleep in the guest room. In truth, she hadn't planned on staying at all. But when Nathaniel had quietly asked if she wanted to wait out the storm instead of driving home, she'd nodded without thinking. Not because of the rain, but because something between them had shifted on the rooftop gently, like the earth turning beneath your feet when you aren't looking. She sat up, blankets sliding from her shoulders, and rubbed her palms together for warmth. The apartment was still. No movement, no music, just the distant hum of traffic far below and the low creak of the building settling into its morning bones. When she stepped into the hallway, she found him in the kitchen. Nathaniel sat in his chair near the island, coffee in hand, backlit by the tall windows. His hair was still tousled from sleep. He wore a soft gray sweatshirt and loose black pants. The sunlight caught in the curve of his jaw, and Serena watched him for a moment. He didn't look like a man waiting to be rescued. He looked like a man who had finally stopped bracing for impact. He turned when he sensed her and offered the smallest smile barely there, but enough to soften the room's edges. "Morning," he said, voice low. "Morning," she echoed, crossing to the counter. There was already a mug set out for her. Steam curled from it in delicate spirals. "You made coffee," she noted, gently amused. "I reheated yesterday's," he admitted. She took a sip. It was terrible. But she said nothing. They stood in that comfortable quiet, sipping, breathing, watching the day slide slowly through the windows. Then, softly, Nathaniel said, "I used to think healing meant returning to who I was before." Serena turned toward him, waiting. "But lately, I've started wondering if healing just means learning how to be someone else, someone softer, even if that version looks nothing like the old one." She set her mug down and leaned back against the counter, arms folded loosely across her chest. "And is that someone you want to be?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at her. Looked. Not just at the shape of her or the presence she carried, but at the weight behind her calm. The way she stood grounded, sure, but never heavy. Her quietness wasn't an absence. It was intentional. "I think," he said carefully, "you make it easier to try." Her breath caught. Not visibly. Not enough to interrupt the rhythm of the moment. But deep inside, something shifted like the subtle tilt of gravity when your heart turns towards something it hadn't allowed itself to hope for. She moved to the sink, poured water, and drank. It gave her time to think, or pretend to. "You've built an entire life out of control," she said quietly, placing the glass down. "Letting someone into that, it isn't weakness. It's a risk. And that risk is terrifying, even when it's beautiful." He nodded, understanding far too well. Then, As if drawn by something beyond thought, she stepped closer. Close enough that he could see the faint glint of morning light in her eyes, the small scar beneath her left brow he hadn't noticed before. Close enough that their hands nearly brushed on the countertop's edge. "I'm not going to disappear," she said. He swallowed hard. "You might. One day." "I might," she agreed, "but not today." And somehow, that was enough. They didn't touch. Not yet. But the space between them was no longer cautious. It was waiting. Later that day, Nathaniel wheeled into the studio he hadn't entered in nearly a year. It wasn't much, just a converted guest room with scattered sketchbooks, unused music stands, a dusty MIDI keyboard, and a wall of unfinished canvases from when his creativity had outpaced his grief. Serena stood just behind the door, leaning against the frame, watching as he ran his fingers along the edge of an old journal. He opened it. Inside, rough sketches, fragments of melody, chords. One page, dated 4 days before the accident, read, "Unfinished lullaby. For the child I haven't met yet." He stared at it for a long time. When he looked up, Serena hadn't moved, but her gaze told him she had already read it from across the room. "You were ready for a different life," she said softly. He nodded. "I was. And now?" He closed the journal gently. "Now I'm wondering if I still could be." Neither spoke after that. She walked in slowly, sat beside him, close but not intrusive. And for the next hour, they didn't discuss dreams, grief, or what was lost. They just sat there, surrounded by traces of who he used to be, quietly wondering if the pieces could be rearranged into something new. Outside, the sky began to clear, just enough for light to fall across the floor in thin, golden streaks. And for the first time in a very long while, Nathaniel didn't look away from the sun. It began with a gesture so small it might have gone unnoticed. Serena was kneeling on the rug in the sunroom, her fingers wrapped gently around Nathaniel's ankle, adjusting his foot into better alignment during resistance stretches. The afternoon light spilled over her shoulder, casting golden curves along the outline of her braid. Her movements were careful, precise, professional, but not detached. Never detached. Nathaniel sat upright in the chair, eyes trained on her hands, though he wasn't seeing them. He was seeing the way her brow furrowed when she concentrated, the way she exhaled softly through her nose when shifting her weight, the way she didn't flinch when touching the parts of him he no longer felt. No one touched his legs the way she did. Not with pity, not with avoidance, just presence. When she was done, she sat back on her heels and looked up. "How does it feel?" she asked. He hesitated. "Strange." She tilted her head. "Painful?" "No. Like, they don't belong to me." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for a towel and began folding it neatly beside her. Not because it needed folding, but because sometimes touch wasn't enough, and silence required an anchor. "You know," she said after a moment, "my sister used to say her body felt like a room she had been locked inside. Some days the windows opened, other days they didn't. But what scared her the most was when people stopped knocking." Nathaniel's breath caught. "And you?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. "What scares you?" She didn't flinch. "I'm afraid of loving someone who never learns to let the light back in." He looked at her, looked, and instantly realized he'd never asked her what she wanted, not honestly. He'd spent so long guarding the borders of his ruin that he hadn't noticed the quiet, careful way she'd drawn near, never crossing without invitation. "You're not trying to save me, are you?" he asked. She gave him a look gentle, unblinking. "No, I'm trying to stay." That answer hit him harder than any declaration could have. He reached for her hand, this time not by accident. His fingers brushed hers, uncertain, testing. She didn't move. He intertwined their fingers, slowly, deliberately, and she let him. The room stilled around them. Minutes passed. Neither spoke. Serena finally shifted, letting go gently, folding the towel, and placing it on the windowsill. But her silence wasn't distant. It was trust. Later that evening, Nathaniel stood, or rather, braced between the parallel bars in the physical therapy alcove, just off the main hall. The bars were installed nearly a year ago, when Hope had been new and unfamiliar. He hadn't used them in months. Serena stood a few feet away, watching him with calm eyes, clipboard forgotten. He glanced at her. "Don't say anything." "I might fall." I wasn't going to say anything. His fingers tightened around the bars. He shifted his weight. 1 foot forward. The right. A slide, more than a step. Then the other. His breath caught, not because of pain, but because of the strain of memory, of what movement used to feel like. He stumbled slightly, catching himself with a sharp exhale. Serena didn't rush to help. She didn't move at all. He straightened, panting, sweat beading at his temple. "Again?" she asked gently. He nodded. They repeated it. 2 steps, then 3. She only approached when his balance began to waver. Her hands found his waist, not possessive, just steady. "You're stronger than you think," she said. "I don't want to be strong," he muttered. "What do you want?" He turned his head toward her, the corners of his mouth twitching, almost embarrassed. "I want again." Serena smiled. Not wide, not bright, just real. "Then that's enough for today." That night, neither of them said goodbye when the session ended. She lingered near the door, coat draped over her arm. He stayed in the kitchen, pretending to tidy the counter. Something unsaid hovered between them, not tense, just alive. Before leaving, Serena turned back. "Do you ever play for yourself anymore?" she asked. He looked at the piano in the next room. "No," he said, "but sometimes I play in my head." Her gaze lingered. Then she nodded and stepped into the elevator. When the door closed behind her, Nathaniel turned off the lights and wheeled into the music room. The moonlight spilled across the floor, catching the silver frame of the old cello in the corner. He rolled past it and stopped in front of the piano. He didn't play. He just sat there, fingers hovering above the keys. And somewhere in the quiet between heartbeats, he realized that wanting wasn't loud. It started softly, like her hand in his, like how her voice sounded when she wasn't trying to be strong, like the first fracture of light after a very long night. That may be enough. The weather turned unexpectedly cold that week, sharp winds slipping through narrow streets, clouds sinking lower over Seattle like a shroud drawn tight. The rain was no longer soft or tentative. It came in with weight, rhythm, and certainty, leaving no part of the city untouched. Nathaniel watched it from his living room window, his breath fogging faintly on the glass. The lights inside were dim, a quiet golden haze casting long shadows across the hardwood. He hadn't spoken much that day, and hadn't needed to. There were days now where silence didn't feel like absence. It felt like breath. Serena was due in an hour, and he was nervous. It wasn't the kind of nerves that came from insecurity or doubt. It was something more profound, older. The type of unease that came when the familiar edges of life began to blur into possibility. He glanced at the small box on the piano bench, wrapped in brown paper, tied with twine. Inside, a simple pendant rose gold, no stones, nothing that glittered, just a smooth, curved surface with a faint etching on the underside. Stay. He hadn't planned on giving it to her. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But he'd ordered it anyway, 2 weeks ago, on a night when the quiet had stretched too long, and her absence had felt more like longing than solitude. Now, it sat on the bench, small and silent, waiting for a decision he wasn't sure he dared to make. The elevator chimed. He didn't move toward the door, not right away. Serena entered with her umbrella closed and dripping at her side, curls damp, cheeks touched by wind. She wore a navy wool coat buttoned to the collar, with a softness in her eyes that she never lost, no matter how cold the outside city became. Nathaniel turned to greet her, his voice lower than usual. "You came through the rain." She smiled, setting the umbrella near the door. "You're not so easy to reschedule." He rolled closer, unsure of how to begin. There was a tension between them, not sharp, not uncomfortable, but present. "I thought," he began, "we could skip the session today." Her brows lifted slightly. "Are you in pain?" "No," he said quietly. "Not in the way you mean." She hesitated momentarily, unbuttoned her coat, and crossed to the couch, sitting without a word. Her posture told him everything he needed to know. She wasn't leaving. Not until he asked her to. He didn't. He sat beside her, or rather, he wheeled to the edge of the couch, turned to face her, and paused. There was something in his hands. She didn't look at it. Not yet. "I don't know what this is," he said. "Then say it anyway." His throat tightened. "You're the first person who's ever stayed without needing me to perform, without wanting me to prove anything." Her eyes didn't leave his. "You've done enough proving, Nathaniel." He nodded, slowly, but his hands were still restless. "This isn't a gift," he said, placing the small wrapped box in her palm. "I mean, it is, but it's not a promise, or a question. Just a moment. Something I wanted you to have before I knew why." Serena looked down, then carefully untied the twine. She opened the box. The pendant caught the light, barely. She traced the small engraving with her thumb. "Stay." Her breath hitched. He watched her. Every muscle in his body braced for her to speak, or worse, say nothing at all. But she didn't rush. She didn't react with the drama he feared or the detachment he dreaded. She held it in her hand like something precious. Then, softly, "This is the first time anyone's ever asked me to stay without needing saving." He swallowed. "I don't need saving." "I know," she said, her voice quiet but full. "That's why I stayed." A long silence followed. Not heavy, not uncomfortable, just full. Then, suddenly, a sharp gasp tore from her. Serena doubled slightly, one hand instinctively moving to her lower abdomen. Nathaniel stiffened. "What's wrong?" She shook her head, trying to catch her breath. It's fine. It's probably nothing." He reached for her hand, steadying her. "Tell me." She looked up at him, cheeks flushed with something more than cold. "I meant to tell you next week," she whispered. "After I was sure. After I had the words." He stared, breath held. Serena exhaled shakily. "I'm pregnant." The word broke over him like light shattering through dark water. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at her, trying to find gravity again. "It wasn't supposed to be possible," she continued, eyes shimmering. "You told me yourself, and I believed you. But I also believed something else, something softer, quieter, that maybe not everything broken stays that way." Nathaniel blinked, a dozen thoughts racing beneath the surface. disbelief, wonder, fear, hope. His voice, when it came, was hoarse. "How long?" "8 weeks," she said, then added, almost in a whisper, "And it's not just one." His eyes widened. She nodded. "There are 3. He made a sound raw, quiet, stunned. Then another. A laugh or a sob or both. "I don't understand," he breathed. "They said I know," she said. "But they also said maybe." And I held on to that. He looked down at their joined hands. Then, slowly, reverently, she brought one hand to her stomach. It was flat still, barely changed. But under the skin, under the quiet, something new was forming. A beginning. He looked up at her, his voice nothing more than air. "Are you afraid?" She smiled, tears on her lashes. "Terrified." He nodded, eyes wet. "Me too." And still, they didn't let go. Not of the silence, not of each other, not of the fragile, beautiful terror that had wrapped itself around their ribs like the first inhale after drowning. Outside, the rain began again, gentler this time. Less like a storm, more like a song. And inside, a man who thought his body was broken, and a woman who had lived her whole life holding pieces too sharp to share, sat together in the trembling hush of something they hadn't expected. Something that didn't need to be perfect to be real. Something that would change everything. It rained again the next morning. Not the rain that poured or raged, but the persistent, rhythmic kind that taps against the glass like a breath waiting to be heard. The sky outside the penthouse was the color of unspoken things. Heavy gray, silvery at the edges, barely letting light through. Inside, Nathaniel sat at the foot of the bed in his room, elbows braced on his knees, fingers laced tightly as if holding his thoughts together. The city murmured below, but he didn't hear it. All he could hear was the echo of her voice from the night before. "There are 3. He hadn't slept. His body had settled into a quiet tension, like the space between thunder and lightning. He wasn't afraid of her, not of Serena, but of what her truth had awakened in him. He'd spent so long learning to live without what he once wanted, long enough that wanting again felt like trespass. And now, he was not just wanted in the curve of a single heartbeat. He was needed. 3 lives. Not theoretical, not someday real, forming, growing beneath the skin of the only woman who had ever stood in his silences without shrinking. And still, a voice inside him whispered, "What if you break this too?" He didn't know how long he had stayed there, only that the soft creak eventually broke the quiet of the door, and then her voice. "You didn't come out." He turned slowly. Without asking, Serena stood barefoot, wearing the oversized hoodie she had stolen from his drawer weeks ago. Her curls were pulled into a loose braid over her shoulder, and though her face looked calm, he could see the tension in how she held her arms close to her body. "I wasn't sure if I should," he said quietly. She took a step forward. "Because of what I said?" He looked at her, eyes storm dark. "Because of what I felt." He waited for her to ask. She didn't. So he continued, voice low, uncertain. "I didn't know how to want something again. Not really. And now that it's here, this..." His hand motioned toward her without touching. "I don't know how to carry it." Serena's face softened, but she didn't rush toward him. She stayed where she was, letting the space between them exist without pressure. "You don't have to carry it alone," she said. "But what if I can't protect it?" he asked. She stepped closer now. "You're not meant to protect it from everything, Nathaniel. To love it. That's enough." He stared at her, the words striking something more profound than she could have known, because no one had ever told him that love could be enough, that it didn't have to fix, solve, or shield. Serena knelt before him, her hands resting gently on his knees, grounding him. "When my sister was dying," she said softly, "I kept thinking love meant I had to save her, that I had to be strong, cheerful, and composed. But in the end, the only thing that ever mattered was that I was there, that she wasn't alone." Nathaniel's jaw clenched. "You're not broken," she whispered. "You're just learning a new way to be whole." Something inside him cracked, not in pain, but in release. He reached forward, hands trembling, and cupped her face. She leaned into the touch, her eyes closing as if she'd been waiting for it. "I'm terrified," he confessed. "I know," she said. "So am I." "But I want them," he whispered. "I want all three. I want you. I want this." She opened her eyes. "And I want you to know," he continued, "that if you stay, it won't be perfect. I'll stumble. I'll overthink. I'll forget how to trust the good things." She smiled softly, tears gathering. "That's okay. I'll remind you." He leaned forward, forehead against hers, breath mingling in the quiet space between them. "I'll do better this time," he said, barely audible. "I'll show up. For all of it." "I know," she whispered. They stayed like that still, close, breathing the same slow rhythm. And in that fragile stillness, the fear didn't vanish. But it no longer stood between them. It stood behind them. That evening, they sat in the music room together. No lights, just the glow of the fire and the steady drizzle against the windows. Serena curled up on the couch, legs drawn beneath her, hands resting over her stomach in a natural gesture that nearly undid him. Nathaniel wheeled to the piano. He didn't ask if she wanted him to play. He just began. The melody was gentle, tentative, unlike anything he'd written before. It rose slowly, without flourish, like the first steps of a man walking through the ruins of what he thought was the end, only to find a garden growing there instead. Serena listened with her eyes closed, and when the music stopped, she didn't open them. Instead, she whispered into the hush, "What was that?" He turned slightly. Something unfinished. For them. Her lips curved faintly. Then, "Don't finish it yet. Let it grow with them." He nodded. And for the first time since the accident, for the first time in years, he didn't feel like time was something to outrun. He thought it was unfolding ahead of him. With her. With them. Outside, the rain had softened again. Inside, 3 heartbeats had already begun writing a story none had expected, but all of them were ready to live. It didn't rain the next day, but everything was still damp. The air was cool, lingering at the window frames, as if the city had quietly wept for something deeply personal during the night, and gently dried its tears before the sun could fully rise. Serena sat at the dining table, her hands wrapped around a cup of hot ginger tea. A gray sweater draped over her shoulders, her hair falling loose down the back of the chair. She didn't speak. She watched Nathaniel as he moved around the kitchen, a sight she had never imagined she would witness. He was busy with the coffee machine, hands slightly clumsy but patient, as though each small motion held a meaning larger than itself. As the cup began to fill, the aroma drifted into the morning air, and Serena felt something inside her soften, like a flower finding sunlight after a long night. "First cup I've ever had made by you," she said softly, the corners of her lips curving. Nathaniel glanced at her, voice low with a half laugh. "If I ruin it, just call it symbolic." She took the cup from his hand, her fingers brushing his. Thin, light, but enough to feel something shifting quietly between them. Something unnamed, but no longer hidden. He sat across from her, saying nothing more. The silence between them now wasn't hesitation. It was space, necessary space, to listen to what hadn't yet been said. Serena rested her hand on the table, tracing the wood grain absently. Do you think someone like us can become a mother, a father, without repeating the things that once hurt us? The question fell, like the softest rain in a room already quiet. Nathaniel looked up, his eyes deep and still as stone beneath water. I think no one ever taught us how to grow up when the most important parts of us were left behind. But maybe, because of that, we don't start with expectation. We start with understanding. Serena didn't answer right away. She remembered sleepless nights in the hospital with her sister, when the only thing she could do was hold her hand and pretend everything would be okay. She remembered the father who silently left after the funeral, without explanation, and all the years she had learned to love herself by learning how to care for others. I'm afraid, she admitted, the fear soft like a sigh. Afraid I'll try too hard. Afraid I'll give so much there's nothing left for me. Nathaniel reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. This time, he didn't ask. He didn't pry or fix. He stayed steady, present, and quiet. Then this time, he said slowly, We'll do it differently. We'll learn together. You pull me back when I retreat, and I'll remind you to breathe when you forget. Serena looked at him for a long time. Then, very softly, she nodded. That afternoon, they sat together in the small room at the end of the hall, the one Nathaniel had once kept closed, heavy with too many things he hadn't been ready to face. The wooden box containing the unassembled crib still lay there, dusty, but no longer a symbol of a stolen future. This time, it was just an object, waiting to be opened. Want to try? Serena asked, a faint smile on her lips. Nathaniel drew a breath, then nodded. You hold the tools. I'll read the instructions. You sure? She tilted her head, eyes teasing. No, he said, but I want to learn. Amid the soft clicks of wooden pieces and instructions spread across the floor, they found a rhythm not fast, not perfect, but complete with life. At one point, Nathaniel paused to watch Serena tilt her head while tying a knot, her brow gently furrowed. At another, she burst into laughter when she noticed he was holding one of the slats upside down. They didn't speak about the future as something to be mapped. They let each moment pass like warm water, gently washing away old fears. When the crib was finally assembled, a little uneven at one corner, they sat on the floor, backs resting against the wall, exhaling in unison. Serena instinctively placed her hand on her belly, in a quiet, graceful gesture no one had taught her. Nathaniel looked at her, his gaze asking without words. I'm still afraid, she said, not looking at him. But today, I don't feel afraid alone. He reached over, not for her hand this time, but to place his palm gently on her belly, where 3 tiny heartbeats had already begun to call his name without sound. Then that's enough, he said, and neither of them said more. In that room filled with freshly assembled wood and scraps of paper strewn across the floor, something had begun to bloom. Not certainty, but readiness. A kind of love that wasn't flawless, but real. The days began to stretch into a rhythm neither of them had planned for. There was no formal conversation about moving in, no declarations carved into the air. Serena began leaving a toothbrush in the bathroom, a book on the nightstand, and a folded sweater draped over the back of the reading chair. And Nathaniel never asked her to take them back. Somehow, her presence began to weave itself into the quiet spaces of the penthouse, the clink of her spoon in the morning tea, the soft rustle of her notebook as she sat cross-legged on the couch. He found her hair ties in the kitchen drawer once, and instead of feeling invaded, he felt steadied, like the place had finally been claimed by something soft. They lay in the dark at night, neither reaching for more than the other's hand. The connection was enough. Warmth shared through touch, not words. It was a Monday when the sonogram appointment came. Serena hadn't mentioned it until that morning, her voice low as she poured coffee, almost as if she were afraid it might scare something away. "They said 8:30, she said, her fingers around the mug's rim. "If you want to come." Nathaniel froze mid-motion. "Of course I want to come." She looked up, then down again. "Okay." They didn't speak again until the car ride. Seattle was wet that morning, fog clinging to the lower buildings. The streets shimmered like slate beneath the tires. Serena watched the blur of red brake lights ahead, and Nathaniel sat beside her in the passenger seat, his hand resting lightly over hers on the gear shift. Neither spoke. The clinic was warm, softly lit, and designed to soothe anxiety without addressing it. They sat side by side in the waiting room, knees nearly touching. Around them, couples whispered, nurses called names, and soft lullaby music drifted through invisible speakers. When her name was called, Serena rose first. Nathaniel hesitated, suddenly unsure. She turned, offering her hand without pressure, just presence. He took it. The technician was kind, brisk, but not impersonal. She asked Serena to lie back, rolled the waistband of her leggings down slightly, and spread cool gel over her belly. The machine lit up with waves and lines and shadows. Nathaniel stared at the screen, unblinking. And then, "There they are," the woman said softly. 3 flickers of light, 3 pulses, fast and intense. Serena turned to look at him, but Nathaniel couldn't take his eyes off the screen. His breath caught sharp, then shaky. "They're real," he whispered. The technician smiled. Very real. He didn't realize he was gripping Serena's hand until she gently squeezed him. Back at the apartment, they didn't talk much. The sonogram photo lay on the table between them. 3 perfect shapes encased in a thin square of thermal paper. Serena reached out and traced one of the forms with her fingertip. "I don't think I'll ever be fully ready," she murmured. Nathaniel's voice came after a pause. "Maybe we're not supposed to be." She looked up. He continued. "Maybe life isn't about being ready. Maybe it's about saying yes anyway, even with shaking hands." Her throat tightened. The fire in the living room crackled softly, casting shifting shadows across the walls. Serena pulled her knees up onto the couch, her sweater slouching at the shoulder, and leaned into the curve of his body beside her. His arm moved around her instinctively. They stayed like that for a long time. Later, as dusk pressed against the windows, Serena stood in front of the mirror in their bedroom, bare feet sinking into the rug. She lifted her shirt and looked at the slight curve of her belly, still subtle, not yet obvious, but undeniable. Nathaniel entered the room quietly, pausing when he saw her. She didn't move, just met his eyes in the mirror. He crossed the room, stopped behind her, and wrapped his arms gently around her waist. His palms flattened over her stomach, covering hers. For a moment, neither said a word. Then he whispered, "I didn't think I'd ever get this close to a beginning again." She leaned back into him. "And now, I want to live inside it." He pressed a kiss to her shoulder, slow and reverent. Later that night, when the city had quieted and the sky had turned to ink, they lay tangled together under a shared blanket, Serena's head resting beneath his chin, Nathaniel's fingers tracing soft circles along the curve of her spine. "Do you ever think," she said quietly, "that maybe we were never meant to find each other until now?" His voice was almost inaudible. Every day. They didn't say I love you. Not yet. Because this wasn't a love declared in haste. It was built like the quiet after the storm, slow, deliberate, and soaked through with truth. And maybe that was how the best kind of love always began. Not as a flame, but as a warmth that taught you how to breathe again. It was nearly spring when they painted the nursery. The air still carried a bite in the mornings, but the afternoons were softer and fuller. The city outside their window had begun its slow thaw, buds forming shyly on the trees, sidewalks wet with melting frost. It felt like a season stretching awake after a long sleep. Nathaniel stood barefoot on the tarp-covered floor, a brush in one hand, the other smeared with pale green. His white t-shirt bore the accidental marks of his efforts, smudges of paint at the hem, a faint fingerprint near the collar where Serena had laughed and pressed her thumb earlier. Across the room, she sat on a small stool, belly rounded beneath her loose cardigan, her legs tucked neatly to one side. She wasn't painting. The fumes were too strong. But she was there, watching, always there. "Are you sure about the color?" he asked, pausing mid-stroke. Serena tilted her head. "It's not about being sure. It's about choosing." He gave a small smile. "Then I'm glad we chose this." The soft green somewhere between moss and sage made the light in the room look different, warmer, kinder. Nathaniel stepped back to admire it and caught Serena's gaze lingering not on the wall, but on him. He raised an eyebrow. "What?" She only shrugged. "You look like someone who's already started becoming." That evening, they sat on the floor with bowls of takeout noodles, legs tangled, laughter spilling between them like wind chimes. The sonogram photo was still taped to the refrigerator. The crib had been moved into place. A mobile Serena had ordered in soft cotton stars waited on the shelf. But the most extraordinary thing in that room wasn't any of those. It was the silence. Not the silence that follows something painful. Not the kind that carries too much weight. This was the kind of silence people earned, the kind born of deep knowing, of breaths shared without demand, of presence that required no explanation. Serena stirred her noodles thoughtfully. "Do you ever wonder what kind of father you'll be?" Nathaniel didn't answer right away. He looked at the window, the city lights blinking softly in the distance, then back at her. "I used to think being a father meant being unbreakable," he said. "Strong all the time, always having answers." He set his bowl down. "But lately, I've been thinking maybe it means something else. Maybe it means showing them how to repair what's broken, how to apologize, how to stand still when someone needs you to be there, even when you don't know how." Serena's throat caught, not because it was perfect, but because it was true. The next morning, Serena woke to the smell of something slightly burning. She found Nathaniel in the kitchen, flipping pancakes that looked more like abstract art than breakfast. He was shirtless, humming something under his breath, utterly unaware that batter was streaked down his forearm. She leaned on the doorframe and smiled. He looked up. "These might not be edible. I like the intention more than the outcome." He wiped his hands on a towel and crossed the kitchen toward her. Before she could tease him again, he cupped her face gently. "There's something I want to ask." She blinked. "Okay." He took a breath. "I want you to stay. Here. With me. For real. I have been staying. I mean, not just here physically. Not just until the babies arrive. I mean after. Through the hard parts. Through the messy parts. I want to build something with you. Do not visit it." Serena looked into his eyes. She'd always feared that asking for the future was demanding too much. But here he was, offering it before she could speak it. And so, she nodded. "I'm already home," she said. Weeks passed. The nursery was finished. The calendar crept closer to her due date. There were birthing classes and appointments, laughter and moments of unspoken exhaustion. There were evenings when her back ached, and he drew warm baths for her in silence. There were mornings she woke up to him holding one side of her belly, talking to the children through sleep-heavy whispers. One night, when the rain returned soft, familiar, they curled into the couch, the fire casting golden light on their faces. Nathaniel rested his hand on her belly. "Do you think they'll know? That they were wanted?" "They'll know," Serena said without hesitation. "Because we'll show them." He looked at her. Then, not just as a lover, not just as a mother, but as the one person who had stood still when the rest of his world had kept moving without him. He leaned in. Their kiss wasn't rushed, wasn't fiery. It was slow, certain, the kind of kiss that says, "We found this. We chose this. We will choose it again." In that moment, no future fear, no shadow of the past, could interrupt the steady hum of something whole taking shape. It wasn't the beginning of their story, but it was the chapter where love stopped being a question, and quietly, irrevocably, became the answer. It happened just before dawn, the kind of hour when the world still holds its breath, when city lights flicker against the last stretch of darkness, and even time seems unsure whether to move forward or stay still. Serena clutched Nathaniel's hand as the hospital room blurred around her. Pain sliced through her, raw and endless, but her focus never shifted from the sound of the monitor beside her, steady, rhythmic, holding 3 tiny heartbeats that now pulsed louder than her own. Nathaniel didn't speak. He didn't try to fix it, calm her, or whisper cliches. He just stayed. His grip was firm, his forehead pressed to hers, a silent anchor in a storm he couldn't stop, but would weather with her completely. Hours passed like waves, relentless, unpredictable. Finally, through screams and trembling and a fierce, breathless push, it was quiet. And then, cries. 3 of them. The room was filled with movement nurses, soft clothes, blinking monitors, but all Serena could hear were those cries. She turned her head, tears streaking her cheeks, and saw Nathaniel frozen. His face broke slowly, like the dawn over mountains. A man unmade, rebuilt, and reawakened in a single instant. "They're here," she whispered. He nodded, voice lost. Later, when the lights had dimmed and the bustle had softened to a hush, they sat side by side on the narrow hospital bed. Serena, exhausted and radiant in that hollowed, sacred way only new mothers wear. Nathaniel's eyes were glassy, and he was cradling the smallest of the 3 in his arms, as if he might break from holding something so perfect. "They have your eyes," he murmured, brushing a fingertip over a downy brow. "And your stillness," she replied, tracing the edge of the baby's curled hand. "Even when they scream." They laughed, too softly to wake the others. That night, they didn't talk about names, feeding schedules, or the fears that would surely return when the silence grew too deep. They just watched the tiny chests rise and fall, watched each other, let its enormity all pass over them like waves, and they didn't run. In the following weeks, life reshaped itself not into order, but into rhythm. There were nights with little sleep, days filled with lullabies and diapers, bottles and burp cloths. There were moments of wonder so piercing that they made them ache, and others when one of them wept quietly in the hallway, overwhelmed, exhausted, human. But through all of it, there was never silence between them, only space, a steady hum of love that had learned to bend but not break. Nathaniel built shelves with one baby sleeping across his chest in a sling. Serena danced barefoot in the living room with another curled in her arms, swaying to music only she could hear. They argued over who rocked longer, then fell asleep with heads touching on the couch before either could win. One morning, as the sun broke over the horizon and the house lay still in that golden hush, Nathaniel stood in the nursery's doorway. 3 cribs, 3 tiny people, 3 lives he never believed he deserved. And Serena, fast asleep in the rocking chair, her hand resting protectively on the edge of the crib. He didn't need a photo. That image, that moment, it was etched somewhere deeper than memory. That was what home looked like, what forgiveness sounded like, what love finally became, not perfect, not cinematic, but real, earned, and chosen every single day. Somewhere, in another version of life, maybe they didn't find their way back. Maybe pride or fear or time kept them apart. But not here. Here, in this story, they stayed. Through the pain, through the healing, through the quiet and the storms. They stayed. Because sometimes, what you're searching for isn't a second chance. It's the courage to live inside the first one, entirely. And that's what they did. Every messy, miraculous day. If this story has found a place in your heart, if it reminded you of someone you once lost, still loved, or you're hoping to meet, leave us a thought in the comments below. Like, share, or follow this journey if you believe love is still worth choosing, no matter how broken or delayed. Always.